Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining us for New York State History Month Talks presented by Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site. I'm Dave, you're the audience, and this is another fine presentation that we are bringing to you. We've got a wonderful presenter, great content, great information, wonderful audience tuning in, and so I thank you all for doing so. But you're here not to listen to me talk. You're here because Sean Kelleher, who is the historian for the town of Saratoga in New York State and the vice president of the Saratoga County History Center, he's going to be presenting, and he is one of the authors also of the Saratoga County Stories, which is a collection of essays and articles from local historians, which provides a veritable who, what, where, when, and why of Saratoga County history, which is released this month. So please welcome Sean Kelleher.
Thanks. Hi. Nice introduction, Dave. So today we're going to talk a little bit about who is Saint Isaac Jogues and why does he matter. Normally when we do talks like this, in our history center, we like to start with a land recognition. And we've worked very delicately on putting together all of these words, so I'm just going to try to read these. We gratefully acknowledge the Native people on whose ancestral homes we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in New York State today. And today we are going to be talking a lot about Native Americans. And as you will see from my background, I am not a historian of Native Americans. Being the Town of Saratoga municipal historian, my comfort zone normally is in 18th century, the American Revolution. I've done a lot of 19th and 20th century. The 17th century stuff's a little early for me, and I've been challenged my whole life trying to understand Native people and their values. And we're going to talk a little bit about their values that I cannot completely explain as a European, but I'll share with you what I know, and we'll try to answer some questions, but there may be certain stuff that I just don't know and don't have the right frame of reference to talk about. So we talked a little bit about how this presentation is kind of an extension of a story that I did for Saratoga County Stories. We've taken 58 of these articles that have been written by a number of historians in Saratoga County. We've put them together as a book. The book's going to go on sale after October 23rd, and we have two events coming up. A week from Saturday on the 23rd, we're going to have small talks and book signing at Brookside, the Saratoga County History Center in the afternoon. If you can't make it there, and I'll just mention this real briefly, we're not going to promote this, but many of the talks that afternoon will also be on our Facebook page as part of Facebook Live. And then on Sunday the 7th, the following week on that Sunday, we're going to be down in Clifton Park at the Grooms Tavern in the hamlet of Rexford. So we'd love to see people. We'll sign books. It's a great opportunity to hear a lot of different people speak, and they make great Christmas gifts. So who is Saint Isaac Jogues? Now, I think most people in this area would say that he's that statue up at Lake George, and he's honored as one of the first Europeans to glaze on that beautiful lake. I particularly like to go up to Lake George this time of year after all the tourists have gone, where the leaves they're not as strong as they were, but it's still a beautiful spot. And he's the one who named the lake Lac du Saint Sacrament. And as you can tell, French is not my native language, but it means the Lake of the Blessed Sacrament. And it remained that name for 100 years until Sir William Johnson renamed it after his king, the good King George II, not the third, the second. Others will know Saint Isaac Jogues as the French Catholic missionary and martyr who traveled and worked with Native people, First Nation populations in Canada and New York. He has a feast day that's coming up, October 19th. He's known as the Apostle of the Mohawks. And locally, where I live in Saratoga, just down the road from me along Saratoga Lake, is Saint Isaac Jogues Chapel. And he's also claimed not only to be the first European to see Lake George, but the first European to see Saratoga Lake. And then there's also a church up in Chestertown that's named for him, along with many other churches, but those are the ones within this area. Now, there's also a little bit of a family tie to this. Now, my accent isn't as strong as it used to be, but believe me, I can park the car in Harvard Yard with the best of them. I was born just outside of Boston, and my grandparents were immigrants from Ireland, and they were Irish Catholic, and they paid attention to shrines. My grandmother, one of her big claims of fame was that she was from the parish of Knock. Now, Knock is a shrine in Mayo, the northwest part of Ireland, a very, very desolate area. But at Knock, people believe that they saw Mary. So it's become a religious shrine. Pope John Paul went there. It's a big to-do, and it's something that my grandmother was always very proud of. So in the 1950s, my immigrant grandparents did fairly well for themselves, and they were the first among their friends to be able to afford a car. So my grandfather had a car, loaded up. He worked for the post office. He had his 2 weeks vacation, loaded everybody up in the car, along with his brother, Tom, and his wife, Bertie, who would be my great uncle and aunt. And most importantly, he loaded up my mother and my aunt Marie. So Claire Marie, Agnes and Jim, Tom and Bertie, all in a car, and they went across Massachusetts, across New York, to Niagara Falls, as many people did. And it was a long ride. And it was a ride that both Tom and Bertie really didn't enjoy themselves, and they let it be known. So when they were coming back, they stopped at the Auriesville Shrine. And at the Auriesville Shrine, because that's what you did when you're a Catholic, you stopped at shrines. So when they were at the Auriesville Shrine, my grandfather had this grand vision that this was not the best of all trips. So loaded everybody up in the car and drove right to Boston. He set his brother and Bertie off and said, "Thanks, we've had enough vacation together." Took his family home, had everybody do the wash. Then he loaded back up the car, and he's like, "Nothing is going to stop me from enjoying this vacation with my mother, Claire, his daughter, and my Aunt Marie." So they continued on. They drove right out to Lake George. They made it up to the North Pole. They really had, 5 days together that they really enjoyed. And so that's how my family is somewhat tied with the shrine, and why this was an important story within our family. So what most people don't realize, of course, is that St. Isaac Jogues was one of the first Europeans not only to venture here, but to share and record his travels, and not only in Saratoga County, but also throughout the Mohawk Valley. So we talk a little bit about his early years. He was born in Orleans, France, in 1607, and he was educated in Jesuit schools, and he entered the seminary at the age of 17. Now, the Jesuits at that time had a strong missionary focus. So 12 years later, he was ordained a priest, and very, very shortly, he was off to New France, to Canada. Now, at this stage of his life, it was the early 1600s. And in Europe, they just had the 30 Years' War. which resulted in between 6 and 8 million casualties. Incredible amount of dead and destruction going on as he's kind of growing up. In science, we have Galileo, Kepler. In education, the focus is the academy. Philosophy, Locke. Literature, Shakespeare, Milton. Paintings, Rembrandt and Rubens. You can see it's an exciting time, but there's also a lot of death and destruction coming up. And then we should talk a little bit about the Jesuits, the order that he went into. It was founded in the 15th century by Ignatius of Loyola, and he founded it as a society of Jesus, the Jesuits. Now, he had a strict intention that there'd only be 60 Jesuits. Well, God had a different plan for him. So by 1615, there were over 13,000 Jesuits. And also in that period, Jesuit colleges grew dramatically, so that there were over 525 colleges by the end of 1645. Now, we all know from our history that this is kind of an age of exploration. This age of exploration met this Jesuit missionary fever. And there were not only missionaries going to North America, there were also missionaries going to Africa. So in that 50-year period, there were over 188 Jesuit martyrs, a large amount, to say the least. Then we all know a little bit about New France. We know the famous explorer was Samuel de Champlain. And we understand the concept that the French were primarily interested in converting the natives to Christianity, to trading with the natives, to have small communities, and then to extract natural resources and trade with those natural resources. Now, at this period, the natural resources that people are most interested in is the beaver pelt. So that's very, very important during this period to understand all that is going on. I always try to make the point when I'm talking about the American Revolution that during that period, the important commodity that was being traded was the sugar from the Caribbean. During this period, it's the beaver pelt. I think many of us in our middle school social studies classes just learn about the beaver pelt and don't learn about the other commodities that are important. And those commodities are very, very important because they kind of explain some of these wars that are going on. So I think I mentioned that I am not a Native American historian, but there were two different activities that explain what are happening for Native people. And various historians believe various things, and I can't really tell what's right or wrong. So I'm going to present both of them real quickly. One is the Beaver Wars. So obviously all the beavers that were easy to be got were gotten by the middle of the 17th century. So there's the need to extract further and further into the central part of the United States, North America, in through the Great Lakes. And the natural way out is, of course, the Great Lakes and then the St. Lawrence. And then we have, of course, the French up in Canada, and then, or New France, and then Albany, which is an Anglo-Dutch area. So those are the two markets for the beaver pelt. And controlling the pathways there, you have two different groups of Native people, First Nations. You have the Iroquois League. Typically, we may also call them the Mohawks or the Haudenosaunee. And then you have a combination of the Hurons and the Algonquins who were allied with the French. So those are the different parties that were involved in these Beaver Wars, as some historians call them. Then you also have this other concept of mourning wars. This is part of Native people's beliefs that if you lose somebody in your family, you can go and you can replace them by capturing another person and bringing them in, and then they take the role of the person who has passed away. So much later in time, in 1740, there was a raid on Saratoga. There were over 70 captives that were brought back up into Quebec, and some of those captives ended up joining Native communities up there because it was a continuation of these mourning wars. Some of them were ransomed back to Boston and then back to New York. So those are kind of the wars that are going on. The other important thing, and you normally, again, being a Bostonian, we look at it as King Philip's War, but it happened with all sorts of Native folks. As Europeans start to explore, start to get introduced to this area, they bring with them diseases from Europe. And the Native folks did not have any immunity to their diseases. As a result, you have large population drops because they can't, they don't have any immunity to smallpox and plague and all these other diseases that were being brought. So you see large losses of communities. You see these wars that make it difficult. And between the two, you end up seeing some sort of a genocide. And it was particularly felt by the Hurons in the early 1650s. Their population dropped dramatically. So Saint Isaac Jogues was assigned as a missionary, and he was assigned as a missionary up in Canada to work with the Algonquin people. And for 6 years, he lived in the village of St. Joseph, learned the ways and the languages of the Huron. And he was also, after that, put in charge of building a new mission at Fort Ste. Marie in Modern, Ontario, Canada. So he was well up into the Great Lakes. And this map, I think, does a good point of showing the various places that he was. And he ended up way out at the end of Lake Superior. But here you can see Fort Ste. Marie. And he ultimately ends up down in Auriesville, down here. Now, the life of a missionary was not a great life. Francis Parkman, who gets used an awful lot by archaeologists. He was a historian, and one of his books was the Jesuits in North America, and he talks about how gloomy February of 1637 was. That they had to go on foot from one affected town to another. Sometimes they were barefoot. It was rainy, it was disgusting, and they would end up at these communities and they would watch the misery and darkness of people dying because of the disease that was going on. And Saint Isaac Jogues and the other missionaries would bring baptism to the sick and dying. And they were trying to bring them some sort of peace before they died. And some people bought into it and other people didn't. And then this is another description where Parkman describes the purity of their motives. These were the missionaries. They were devoted to self-sacrifice, and they were basically heroes of this primitive church, and that their virtue was being missionaries. So the first time that Jogues had some problems was in August 3rd, 1642, where himself and two brothers, civilians who were working with the missions, Colter and Galou, and a group of Christian Hurons were heading back from the Great Lakes area to Quebec City, and they were ambushed by a group of Mohawks. They were beat. All of them were beaten and tortured, especially Isaac Jogues. And the war party took them on a 100-mile journey from Quebec into the Mohawk Valley. And along the way, they were brought from village to village to be tortured. And that was part of the ritual torture that went on. And throughout this captivity, while he was being tortured, Isaac Jogues would comfort people who were in less health than he was, who were hurt more. He would baptize Native people. He heard confessions and would absolve the other prisoners of their sins. He was ultimately given to an older Mohawk to work as a slave, doing menial tasks, and sometimes tasks that were designed to embarrass him. Here's some of the art of Saint Isaac Jogues, and one of the things that you'll notice about that is his fingers. His fingers were they were tortured. So part of his menial tasks was in March of 1643, he accompanied his master to Saratoga Lake for spring fishing. This was quite common for Native people. They would winter in large groups, and then they would go off. The women, some of the men would do plantings at in and around the Mohawk Valley of Corn and the Three Sisters. And the men would go on fishing trips and they would go on hunting trips. In Saratoga Lake, in particular, the creek that leads from Saratoga Lake, Fish Creek, feeding down to the Hudson River, was one of their favorite spots because it was a natural spot for fish to come up and to spawn. So they would set up these fishing weirs right in the creek and capture all sorts of fish, and they would bring that back. So that was an important part of their food. So St. Isaac Jogues was at Saratoga Lake. The Dutch in Albany had heard about St. Isaac Jogues, or Isaac Jogues, Father Jogues, and they tried to free him and ransom him, but they were unsuccessful. But ultimately, Isaac Jogues was able to escape, and he got to Albany, and it took him a couple of days. The Mohawks were looking for him. He was in Albany and then Kinderhook, and ultimately he was ferried down to New York City, and he became the first Catholic priest to see New Amsterdam, New York City, and then he was journeying back to France. So I mentioned this ritual torture that happened to him. Part of that was gnawing or actually eating on his fingers. So he became crippled as a missionary from this. When he got back to Europe, he was received, as he had been risen from the dead. He was an object of curiosity and reverence. He had an audience with Queen Anne of Austria, who kissed his mutilated hands. Pope Urbain gave him permission to celebrate the Mass, even though he had his mutilated hands. The Pope is said to say that a martyr of Christ should be allowed to drink the blood of Christ. But within a year of being within France, he wanted back. He saw his calling was to be a mission. It's Mohawks. So he headed back. He ended up in Canada, and he had somewhat of a relationship with the Iroquois. So he was sent down to discuss a peace treaty between New France and the Iroquois. And he traveled the traditional pathway of the Hudson River through Saratoga County. He made it down to Albany to thank the people who helped him escape. And then he went out to the Mohawk Valley. He had a successful peace mission. He brought peace there, and then he started heading back up towards Canada, but he determined that that wasn't enough. And he was determined to start a mission in Auriesville to share his Catholic belief with the Mohawks. And when he returned, within that year, he was not welcomed. He left behind a box of items, and that box in his visit were blamed for the crop failure that they were suffering. So he was seized by the Mohawks, and they gave him, unfortunately, a cruel beating, and then a blow from a tomahawk, which gave him his crown for martyrdom. He died on October 18th, 1646. Now, I saw that date, didn't think too much about that date, but I said, oh, I wonder how many years it is. So I did some quick math. Thank goodness for Google and its math. It turns out that it's 375 years ago Monday. It just happened that way. It wasn't anything that I had planned, but I think it's kind of interesting that happenstance has worked out so that we're at least remembering an event that happened 375 years ago within our region, within our community. So a little bit more of the story after the martyrdom. Auriesville was abandoned by the Mohawks in 1660. And at the end of the French and Indian War, the Jesuits were expelled from North America. They returned in the 19th century. And when they returned, they had a great interest in these earlier martyrs, the earlier Jesuits that. So they started to research them, and they found the village of what we know today as Auriesville through archaeology in the 1884. So quite early archaeology. And the following year, it was purchased by the Catholic Church as a holy site. Now, pilgrims started there as early as 1886. And 2 years later, in 1888, they had over 1,200 communions taken in one day at an open air chapel. Now, plans were to build a large gathering spot, what became the Colosseum. They had to be delayed during World War I. But by 1931, they had what's there today, a large Colosseum with seating for 6,500 people, standing room for another 3,500. And it not only remembers Saint Isaac Jogues, but it also remembers Jean D. Burfet and the 6 other martyred missions, all Jesuit priests or laymen, and they were all canonized by the Catholic Church, meaning that they became a saint in 1930. So they're known collectively as the North American martyrs. And here's a listing of all of them. My understanding is that half of them are died in what is now in the United States, and the other half of them died in Canada. So we have the National Shrine at Auriesville, which we had mentioned before. One of the things that I find interesting, and I don't know how many people have, hopefully most of you have been to this site. It's a beautiful site, but to me, it's always an interesting site. It says something about tourism. It says something about the Catholic Church. Part of what I've always found interesting is that until recent times, there's little recognition that this was a major Native American site. So in recent years, there's been additional interpretation to include the religion, the Native American, the Mohawk village that was there. But early on, there wasn't. It was really a focus in on the saints in the Catholic Church. And then, of course, the other interesting thing in more recent history is that part of the land and next to the shrine, a group of Buddhists have purchased it. And now the Buddhist temples and Buddhist symbols somewhat overwhelm the Catholic symbols that are at that site. And I understand that there's some interesting relationships, difficult relationships between the two religious groups. But I really don't have much more detail on that. Now, why is he important? One of the interesting things that ties in here is the famous author, Willard Catherwood, the Pulitzer Prize novelist, seemed to draw some inspiration from the North American martyrs and Saint Isaac Jogues. It's mentioned in her book, The Shadow on the Rocks. She has an actual quote in there from a 12-year-old character. And she also discusses it in one of her unpublished books. So she had spent some time in the area of the Auriesville Shrine. She wasn't necessarily Catholic at all, but she seemed to find some sort of fascination about this. And she kind of worked this into her novels that really dealt with settlers moving in on the Western states in the 19th century. She talked about nostalgia and exile, and that sense of a place was really important to her. And you just can't go to Auriesville and not feel some sort of sense of place and sense of reverence. It's one of those interesting places. So what can we learn from St. Isaac Jogues? Obviously, we can learn about inconvenience, humility, how important it is to make friends. We can learn to practice tolerance, learn how to love people who are different than us. We have to look back that during this season, or during this period in the 16th century, the best and the brightest in France became Jesuits. And St. Isaac Jogues certainly talks about how important it is to live your identity. It would have been a lot easier for him to just stay in France after the first time he was tortured. But he had a drive and an interest to go forward. We are seeing a time, unfortunately, of epidemics and genocide in Africa in particular. The Huron people lost somewhere between a half and 2/3 of their population during this time. It had a destructive, devastating effect on families and clans, and it disrupted their society's structure and tradition. One of the other things is, of course, is that Saint or Father Isaac Jogues learned the language of his people. He learned the language of the Huron people. He had a zeal for souls. He made effort to evangelize, and he focused in on his calling, which was to be a missionary. He acted out of love of God, and he leveraged his gifts and talents. Now, I know that that's normally a little bit more religious than than I would normally do as a historic talk, but that's really part of the lessons that we can learn from it. So, in closing, how can you learn more about him? There's a number of biographies that are available through the local library. I happen to love our library system. Our library system in Saratoga County is the same library system, or the same, it's not the same library system, but it's the same back end hard catalog system as the Mohawk Valley, so it's easy to get books from our entire region. So I strongly suggest doing that, and it's a great system. Want to mention we have a number of interesting programs going on in Saratoga County through our History Center, and there's the web address for Brookside. I, of course, want to mention the books that we've had a team that's worked so hard on, and they're will be available from our bookstore after the 23rd, but we have those 2 special days that I mentioned at the beginning. I have, because who wouldn't, I have a blog. I do a daily blog about my town's history, and the site of the Burgoyne surrender and the turning point to the American Revolution. It's not all American War of Independence, but a lot of it is. And that's what I have for you folks. So I'm going to stop sharing here.
Actually, if you want to put that, Sean, if you put that last page back up, and that way, if people want to write down that information, that contact, I did put the link up on the thing, but that gives the opportunity for those viewing here this evening, or those that are going to be tuning in to the recording later. They can.
I will do that.
Check that out. So as I had mentioned before, we'll take some questions here at the end. You can use that chat function to type in your question, and then I will moderate it. I will pose it to Sean. He can answer the question from there. But I made a couple of notes along the way, and the very first note that I wrote down here was just noting that you called George II the Good King George. So that was,
yes.
I had a chuckle on that one, so I appreciate that. And it's I was glad that you went through with when he was born, and then the 375 years ago this Monday that he was martyred. And thinking to myself, this guy's about 40 years old. That's my age, and I don't know how much of the torture I could have tolerated, or 100 miles through the Adirondacks. Seems like quite the endurance for at least a about 40-year-old of today. That seems like a lot, and
yeah,
so again,
there's no doubt. I mean, just imagine the indications were that he was bound through most of that. So, and that was somewhat typical for 100 years. My research has been in the past a little bit more about the 1745 raid here in Saratoga. So again, the captives were people were captives here and brought up to Quebec, and they were bound for most of that trip. So yeah, just imagine that that type of trip. I think the better part of his trip was that he had better weather. In the 45 captives went up. The raid happened in early December, so it would have been winter. And then, you could also point to the Schenectady raid in 1690. Again, very, very long trip in very, very bad weather.
Right, right, and being wholly unprepared, and probably not having any real sustenance along that journey, those moments of torture. But I do also like that, not that this corresponds to the moments of torture, but your personal connection that you opened with about the family vacation, and how a lot of this really and you kind of harkened on the trip to the shrine being a tourist destination, or ultimately these are stories of journey, or some other memorable experience for good or bad. So I appreciated that, and it's that nice personal connection that you have to what you were going to be presenting about. I'm not seeing any questions come in at the moment, but there's a few other things I noted here. Your commentary about the Beaver Wars, and the combination perhaps of Beaver Wars and the Morning Wars, or that ritual or custom of replacing lost loved ones through capture. There was it's Iroquois diplomacy. It also talks about the ritual, the traditions and the culture behind meeting at the edge of the woods, and there's a book out there that kind of discusses that, that I always found really fascinating, in which, as you stated, the people were brought back, they're kind of adopted into family as a lesser version of the lost person, to replace their duties and their roles. And Parkman, you bring up Francis Parkman. Uncommon Wolf is one of my favorite books. His writing style's fantastic. So that's also a nice thing to kind of venture into. And this is kind of outside of this particular thing, but I thought maybe the comparison of, I don't know if you're familiar with the Harman Mindert's Vandenberg art. May mispronouncing that because I'm not Dutch. But his journey into Mohawk country, documented in 1634, where he'd left Albany to ask particularly the Oneidas about the beaver, the peltry, that was actually kind of heading up into Canada more than the merchants of Albany, those Anglo and Dutch. I don't know if you're familiar with that, or if you have any thoughts. Maybe, like, obviously there's a difference in their journey, but it's within that same kind of time frame.
Yeah, I don't know much about it. It's outside of my my interest in scholarship. Again, normally I focus more on the 18th century, and the only thing that I can somewhat relate it to is, I don't know anything about that journey, but to me, the important thing is, from my perspective, being in Saratoga, so being the far part of the travel and trade back and forth, because obviously, logistically, if you want to trade pelts, the best way would be to go right through New France and Montreal and Quebec. But they weren't always getting the best prices there. So people were interested in Albany, they were interested in the wampum. And the best way to get there, of course, would be through the Mohawk Valley. And you have different native groups and people. I'm thinking of Johnson, thinking of the Indians at in and around your area right there. But there was still an awful lot of trade and an awful lot of illegal trade, because you couldn't go from the Dutch English to the French, going up and down the Hudson and the Champlain. And that's where Saratoga kind of played in, because we are at the end of the borderline, or the border from Albany, and we jump back between Fort Edward and Saratoga. So there was an awful lot of illegal trade going back and forth on this traditional pathway of the Hudson, Champlain, and Richelieu. So that's really the only place that my scholarship kind of plays into that. And I'm always kind of looking at the interrelationship of the Schuyler family in particular, were the patrons of Saratoga, and some of the other families, aka the Johnsons, out in your neck of the woods, and how those two um, power families played off each other for the trade, and the Schuyler, and knowing that the Schuylers have ties with the other Dutch families, in particular, Rensselaers. So that interplay has always interested me, but it is 100 years later than what we were talking about today.
Right, right. And it is extremely interesting. It's sort of in the modern context, almost you know, I guess the Schuyler Johnson is, the major industries of the world today play, or commerce sectors of almost like Bezos versus the Walton family,
Yeah,
something to that effect. So there is a question that's come through, Lawrence is asking if you could talk about the dictionary and language that was documented during his life with the Iroquois.
yeah,
And also, yep,
yeah.
go ahead.
Really don't know anything about that. Yeah,
Okay, and if there's any comments on the bishop of the Dutch church who helped escape to New Amsterdam.
yeah. Again, I don't know much about that. I just know that the Dutch helped him do it, and that he was most appreciative of it. Um, I don't know, the books that I looked at didn't particularly include um, the bishop in it, but I will admit that I was reading a lot of secondary sources, and I was reading somewhat quickly. Initially, my focus was just Saratoga County. Um, so yeah, that's
But I think this helps kind of prove that this is a topic that is interesting to a lot of folks, and deserves a little bit other exploration. Maybe not necessarily on your part if you're focusing more
right.
obviously as your function as a historian in
Yes.
Saratoga, but there's also the New Netherlands project that probably has some interesting information that might be gleaned from there as well. Um, and I had mentioned this other journey into Mohawk country that, and since I'm a huge supporter of libraries and really do also enjoy the Saratoga Library quite a bit when I'm able to present there or to visit, and I
Yeah.
believe they would have it in theirs or not, but there's the book that I referenced, the journal in which Vandenberger makes his journey. There's the journal that you can read, but there's also if you're trying to hook the young ones, I guess there is a graphic novel that was established. It actually is almost every word of the journal put out with illustration to appeal to that kind of an audience. And I brought up most because there's features to it that would help kind of illustrate perhaps those villages in which the father's being taken through and tortured. It's
Yeah.
not it's not describing torture necessarily, but that would help people maybe visualize or understand what he's experiencing, being the kind of the first to visit a lot of those places in that era. Um, Speaking of experiences too, if there's anybody that has any other questions, whatever, I love the point that you're making about the shrine, and I'm grateful to hear that there's more that they are presenting, sort of about the Haudenosaunee people and the First Peoples connection to that as a homeland. Um, but there is, obviously there's been pilgrimages there for the more than 100 years. Large groups, like you said, you mentioned the size of that Colosseum,
Yeah.
and just the numbers of people, even up to just a few weeks ago, large pilgrimage coming through the area for such an event. But my own personal first experience going to the shrine was, as a teenager in the middle of the night, and there was something quite moving, and it's this weird interaction of stirring yet peace, if that makes any sense, in which
Yeah.
you go in, particularly the candles are illuminating the space. There's a lot to be said about the way that it was designed, the architecture, and just the sensations you get being on that ground. So for those that may not have otherwise experienced that area, it also has a wonderful view of the valley, and it's totally worth going to check that out. Other places that I think are worth a drive is obviously checking out parts around Saratoga, doing some heritage tourism in the Saratoga area, maybe stopping over into the Brookside,
Yeah.
checking out some of the events and programs. Definitely, trying to find a place to get a hold of one of these newly released books would be a good thing as well. Is that being sold at the local booksellers as well?
We're working on that. Obviously, we have Northshire in Saratoga Springs, and I believe they're going to be carrying it, which is probably one of the better independent bookstores in upstate. I'm gonna use this as a shameless plug on the History Center Brookside. We've been able to basically this time of year put together 4 brand new exhibits that were opened in June. During the summer, we have a fifth. We have a beautiful herbal garden and other gardens there. But we have brand new exhibit, top notch, on 100 years of the Stewart's family and the Stewart shop, which has been great. And well, I shouldn't say Stewart's family, it's the Dake family who have operated Stewart's. And of course, Stewart's is an iconic Saratoga County store and an iconic upstate store. We have we have mystery photos from Eastern Saratoga County, an exhibit that I curated that's focused in on some of the earliest photography from Saratoga, Eastern Saratoga County. Some of the images we know and we've been able to tell that story. Some of the images we don't know. We have an exhibit that will be only open, I believe, through the end of the month on the social history of hats. We partnered with Skidmore College in one of their undergraduate classes, and they took part of our large hat collection and they told the story of those hats. So there's about 20 some odd hats that are part of that exhibit. And the last is we did rural stores of Saratoga County. Before there were Stewart's, there were all these rural stores that people would carry on trade, but then also talk to each other, the gossip of the day. And they also operated as the local bank. And so we have a collection of those that a number of people have enjoyed seeing or taking photos of and having a little remembrance. So that's been great. And we've also redid our research area. So we have a brand new library that's quite bright and a great place to do research about Saratoga County or your family genealogy. So that's my plug for the History Center.
Very good. Thank you very much. I don't see any further questions, and I greatly appreciate your time. Thank you to those that have tuned in, whether you're here on our live WebEx or you're watching it later on YouTube. Really appreciate that. Make sure that you send us a quick note and let us know what you thought of it. Sean, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for this presentation. This is great. I'll be in contact with you again soon.
Okay, great. Have a nice night, everybody.
Thank you all. Be well.